The forest knows when something doesn't belong. It grows quiet. The birds stop calling. The insects cease their endless drone. Even the wind seems to hold its breath, waiting. In the winter of 1907, 3 men walked into the Ouachita Mountains of western Arkansas carrying rifles, provisions for 2 weeks, and a confidence born from years of hunting those same woods. Their names were Thomas, Robert, and Daniel Ellison, brothers aged 38, 35, and 32 respectively. They knew every ridge, every hollow, every creek that carved through that ancient landscape. They'd hunted there since childhood, following trails their father had shown them, trails his father had shown him. On December 3, 1907, the Ellison brothers entered the forest at dawn. They never came home. Search parties found their camp 2 weeks later, untouched, food still packed, rifles stacked neatly against a tree. But the brothers were gone. What the searchers found instead, carved into the bark of a massive oak tree at the center of their campsite, were 3 words that would haunt the region for decades. 3 words that made no sense then and make even less sense now. 3 words that suggest the Ellison brothers didn't leave the forest. They were taken, and whatever took them wanted everyone to know it was coming back. Welcome to this channel. Today, we step into a case that is not just difficult to understand, it reshapes the meaning of fear itself. Like the video, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? The Ellison family had lived in Montgomery County, Arkansas, since the 1850s. They were farmers primarily, working 160 acres of rocky soil near the town of Mount Ida, but like many families in that region, they supplemented their income through hunting and trapping. The Ouachita Mountains provided deer, bear, turkey, and valuable furs that could be sold to traders. The 3 Ellison brothers were considered among the best hunters in the county, men who could track game through conditions that would confound others, men who could survive in the wilderness for weeks with minimal supplies. Their father, Joseph Ellison, had trained them well before his death in 1899. Joseph had been a mountain man in his youth, one of the last of that breed, and he'd passed down knowledge accumulated over decades of living close to the wild places. The brothers respected the forest in the way their father had taught them, with caution and awareness, understanding that the mountains were beautiful but indifferent to human life. In November of 1907, the brothers began planning their annual winter hunting trip. They'd made this trip every year since their father's death, partly for practical reasons, but mostly as a way of honoring his memory. They would venture deep into the Ouachitas, to a region their father had called the Deep Hollow, a remote valley accessible only by foot through difficult terrain. Game was plentiful there because few hunters made the effort to reach it. The brothers would establish a base camp and spend 2 weeks hunting and trapping before returning home with enough meat and pelts to sustain their families through winter. They'd made this exact trip 8 times before without incident. The 9th trip would be different. On the morning of December 3, 1907, the 3 brothers said goodbye to their families and began the long walk into the mountains. Thomas's wife, Margaret, later testified that her husband had seemed troubled that morning, unusually quiet. She'd asked him if something was wrong. Thomas had looked at her for a long moment before saying, "I had a dream last night. We were in the forest and something was following us. Something that walked like a man but wasn't." Margaret asked what he meant. Thomas shook his head and said, "Just a dream. Don't worry about it." But Margaret did worry. She stood on the porch and watched her husband disappear into the tree line, and she later told investigators that she had a powerful premonition she would never see him again. Robert's wife, Eliza, reported a similar conversation. Robert had told her that morning that he felt they shouldn't go, that something felt wrong about this year's trip, but his brothers were counting on him and he wouldn't let them down. Daniel, the youngest, was unmarried and lived with his mother, Sarah Ellison. Sarah later said Daniel had been cheerful that morning, excited about the trip, showing no signs of the unease his brothers had expressed. The brothers' planned route took them along trails they knew well. They would follow Caddo Creek for approximately 8 miles, then turn northwest and climb into the higher elevations, eventually reaching the deep hollow by late afternoon. They planned to establish their camp there and begin hunting the following morning. The weather was cold but clear, ideal for traveling. Several people saw them that first day. A farmer named Clayton Hughes encountered them around noon near where Caddo Creek crossed the main wagon road. Hughes later told the sheriff that the brothers seemed in good spirits, that they'd stopped to chat for a few minutes about the hunting prospects and the weather. Hughes said goodbye and watched them continue up the trail. He was the last person known to have seen the Ellison brothers alive. When the brothers failed to return by December 18th, their families became alarmed. The brothers had said they'd be gone 2 weeks, returning by the 17th at the latest. By the 19th, with no sign of them, Margaret Ellison went to the county sheriff, a man named Walter Drummond. Drummond knew the Ellison brothers personally, had hunted with them on occasion, and understood they were experienced woodsmen who wouldn't get lost or injured easily. Nevertheless, he organized a search party. On December 20th, 1907, 23 men entered the Wachitas to look for the missing brothers. They followed the known route to the deep hollow, calling out names, firing rifles to signal their position, hopping for a response. They reached the deep hollow on the afternoon of the 21st and found the brothers' camp. The camp was exactly as it should have been, and that's what made it so disturbing. The brothers had cleared a space in a grove of pine trees and set up a tarpaulin shelter. Their bedrolls were laid out neatly. Their provisions were stacked in a canvas bag hanging from a tree branch to keep animals away. Their 3 rifles were propped against a tree, loaded and ready. A fire ring had been prepared with stones, though no fire had been lit. Everything suggested the brothers had arrived, set up camp, and then simply vanished before they could begin their hunting. The search party examined the site carefully. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no indication of violence. The brothers' tracks were visible in the soft earth, showing they'd moved around the campsite, but then the tracks simply stopped, not led away into the forest, not obscured by weather or other tracks. They just stopped as if the brothers had evaporated. Sheriff Drummond expanded the search. Over the next 4 days, nearly 60 men combed the area, working outward from the camp in widening circles. They checked every hollow, every ridge, every place where injured men might have taken shelter. They found nothing. No bodies, no clothing, no equipment. The Ellison brothers had disappeared as completely as if they'd never existed. On the morning of December 25th, Christmas Day, one of the searchers, a man named Silas Morrow, made a discovery that changed the nature of the investigation. He'd returned to the brothers' campsite to look for clues that might have been missed. As he stood in the center of the camp, he happened to look up at the large oak tree that dominated the grove. Carved into the bark about 7 feet above the ground were 3 words, fresh cuts made recently, the sap still tackling. The words read, "They are ours." If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Morrow immediately called the other searchers. They gathered around the tree, staring up at the carved message. The letters were crude but deliberate, each about 6 inches tall, cut deep into the bark with a sharp blade. Several questions arose immediately. Who had carved the message? When had it been carved? And most importantly, what did it mean? The searchers examined the tree carefully. The cuts were definitely recent, probably made within the past 2 weeks. But who made them? The Ellison brothers themselves. Someone else who'd been at the camp. The message's phrasing was odd. "They are ours" suggested possession. Claimed ownership. But who was claiming the brothers, and on whose behalf was the message left? Sheriff Drummond had the area around the tree searched thoroughly. No footprints were found except those of the search party. No other signs of human presence. The message seemed to have appeared without anyone approaching the tree to carve it. The discovery of the message transformed the case from a search and rescue operation into something darker. Drummond began investigating the possibility that the brothers had been murdered, their bodies hidden, and the message left as some kind of taunt. But murder required motive, and the Ellison brothers had no known enemies. They were well liked in the community, honest men who paid their debts and kept to themselves. Drummond interviewed everyone who'd had contact with the brothers in the weeks before their disappearance, looking for signs of conflict or trouble. He found nothing. The brothers had been planning their trip, working their farm, living their normal lives. There was no indication that anyone wished them harm. The case attracted attention beyond Montgomery County. The Arkansas Gazette newspaper in Little Rock published an article about the missing hunters on December 30th, 1907. The article included details about the mysterious carved message and speculated about what might have happened. The article caught the attention of a detective from Little Rock named Harold Gaines, who specialized in unusual cases. Gaines traveled to Mount Ida in early January of 1908 and offered his services to Sheriff Drummond. Together, they conducted a more systematic investigation. Gaines was particularly interested in the carved message. He had a photographer document it from multiple angles, and he made detailed sketches of the letter forms. He noted that the carving technique suggested someone working quickly but with purpose, that the cuts were clean and showed no hesitation marks. Whoever carved the message knew exactly what they wanted to say. Gaines also investigated the brothers' backgrounds more thoroughly. He discovered something that Sheriff Drummond hadn't known. The Ellison family had a history of unusual disappearances. Joseph Ellison, the brothers' father, had a brother named Samuel who had vanished in the Ouachita Mountains in 1862. Samuel had gone hunting alone and never returned. His body was never found. Joseph's father, the brothers' grandfather, had lost a brother as well, a man named Josiah who disappeared while trapping in the mountains in 1837. Again, no body was ever recovered. Gaines found this pattern troubling. 3 generations of Ellison men, all disappearing in the same mountain range, all while hunting or trapping. It could be coincidence, men taking risks in dangerous wilderness, but the pattern was suggestive of something else. Gaines interviewed Sarah Ellison, the brothers' mother, asking about the family history. Sarah was reluctant to discuss it at first, but eventually she revealed something she'd never told the sheriff. She said the Ellison family had always had what she called an understanding with the mountains. Her husband Joseph had told her that his grandfather, the father of the man who disappeared in 1837, had made some kind of agreement with something in the forest, though Joseph had never explained what kind of agreement or with what. Sarah said Joseph had been uncomfortable discussing it, that he'd seemed frightened of the subject. She said that before Joseph died, he'd told her that one day the mountains would collect what they were owed, that the Ellison family couldn't escape their debt forever. Sarah had thought he was delirious from fever, rambling about old superstitions. Now she wondered if he'd known something, if he'd been trying to warn her. This revelation led Gaines to investigate local folklore about the Ouachita Mountains. He spoke with old-timers who'd lived in the region their entire lives, people who knew the stories and legends passed down through generations. Several mentioned something called the forest people, beings that supposedly lived in the deepest parts of the mountains, creatures that resembled humans but were not human. The descriptions varied. Some said the forest people were spirits of natives who'd lived there before the settlers arrived. Others said they were something older, something that had been in the mountains long before humans of any kind. The consistent elements in the stories were that the forest people protected their territory, that they would tolerate human presence to a point but would exact punishment on those who took too much or stayed too long, and that they could make people vanish without leaving any trace. Gaines dismissed these stories as folklore, colorful local legends with no basis in fact, but he couldn't ignore the parallels between the legends and what had happened to the Ellison brothers. The complete disappearance, the lack of bodies, the cryptic message that suggested the brothers had been claimed by something. Gaines was a rational man, trained in modern detective methods, but he found himself considering possibilities that his training told him were impossible. He decided to spend time in the deep hollow himself, to experience the place where the brothers had vanished, hoping it might provide insight. On January 15, 1908, Gaines, accompanied by Sheriff Drummond and 2 deputies, hiked into the mountains and camped at the site where the brothers had disappeared. The four men spent 2 nights at the location. Gaines' journal from those nights, which still exists in the Arkansas State Archives, makes for unsettling reading. He described feeling watched constantly, even when he could see no one around. He described sounds in the forest that seemed to move in patterns, circling the camp, coming closer then retreating. On the second night, Gaines wrote that he woke around 2 in the morning to find one of the deputies standing at the edge of the camp, staring into the darkness. When Gaines approached him, the deputy didn't respond, didn't even seem to notice Gaines was there. He just stood, staring, his eyes unfocused. Gaines touched his shoulder, and the deputy snapped out of whatever trance he'd been in, gasping and stepping backward. The deputy said he didn't remember getting up, didn't remember walking to the edge of camp. He said he'd been dreaming about walking into the forest, following voices that were calling him, and then suddenly he was awake and Gaines was touching him. The deputy was badly shaken. They broke camp at first light and returned to Mount Ida. Gaines wrote in his journal, "There is something in that place that affects the mind. I felt it myself, a pull toward the trees, a whisper at the edge of hearing. I cannot explain it rationally, but I understand now why men might walk into that forest and not return." If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Gaines returned to Little Rock and filed his report. He concluded that the Ellison brothers had likely been murdered by person or persons unknown, their bodies hidden in the vast wilderness of the Ouachitas, and that the carved message was meant to frighten or mislead investigators. It was the conclusion that best fit the evidence without requiring belief in anything supernatural. But privately, in letters to colleagues, Gaines expressed doubts. He wrote to a fellow detective that he believed something had happened in those mountains that defied conventional explanation, that the Ellison brothers had encountered something that removed them from the world, and that whatever it was might still be there, waiting for others. Gaines never worked another case in the Ouachitas. He told people who asked that he saw no reason to return to that region. The families of the Ellison brothers were left without answers or closure. Margaret Ellison held out hope for years that her husband might somehow return, that he'd been injured and lost his memory, that he was alive somewhere. But as the years passed, hope faded. The brothers were declared legally dead in 1914, 7 years after their disappearance. Their farms were divided among family members. Their children grew up without fathers, told stories about the men who'd walked into the forest and never came home. The case remained officially unsolved. Sheriff Drummond continued to receive occasional tips and reports, none of which led anywhere. By 1920, most people in Montgomery County had accepted that the truth would never be known. But the story didn't end there. In 1923, 16 years after the brothers disappeared, a hunter named Ezra Cole was tracking a deer through the deep hollow when he found something unusual. It was a rifle, weathered and partially buried in leaves, but still recognizable as a hunting rifle from the turn of the century. Cole took the rifle to the sheriff, who by then was a man named Eugene Fletcher, Drummond having retired. Fletcher examined the rifle and found markings that identified it as having belonged to Thomas Ellison. How the rifle had gotten to where Cole found it, more than a mile from the brothers' original campsite, was a mystery. The rifle showed no signs of damage, no rust despite having been exposed to weather for over 15 years. It looked as though it had been placed there recently, carefully positioned where someone would eventually find it. The discovery prompted a new search of the area. Fletcher organized a small party and spent 3 days combing the region where the rifle had been found. They discovered 2 more rifles, identified as having belonged to Robert and Daniel Ellison, located at different points roughly equidistant from where Thomas's rifle had been found, forming a triangle approximately 2 miles on each side. Like Thomas's rifle, these showed no signs of having been exposed to the elements for 16 years. They looked almost new. Fletcher couldn't explain it. He considered the possibility that someone had stolen the rifles from the original campsite and only recently placed them in these locations, but that didn't explain why or how the rifles had been preserved so well. A firearms expert examined all 3 rifles and confirmed they dated from the correct period, and showed the right wear patterns for having been used regularly up until around 1907, but then showed almost no deterioration after that date. It was as if the rifles had been frozen in time. More disturbing discoveries followed. Over the next decade, items that had belonged to the Ellison brothers periodically appeared in the Deep Hollow area. In 1928, a trapper found one of Daniel Ellison's boots, identified by his mother from distinctive repair work she'd done on it. In 1931, hikers found a knife that had belonged to Robert, his initials carved into the handle. In 1935, a hunting party discovered a leather journal that had belonged to Thomas. Each item was found in a different location, none showing appropriate weathering for having been in the forest for decades. The journal was particularly unsettling. The last entry, dated December 3, 1907, the day the brothers arrived at their camp, read, "We reached the hollow at sundown. Something is wrong here. The forest is too quiet. Daniel says he hears voices, but I hear nothing. We'll make camp and investigate tomorrow. If we don't return, tell Margaret I." The sentence ended there, unfinished, the ink trailing off as if Thomas had been interrupted mid-word. The periodic appearance of the brothers' belongings created a folklore of its own. People began to believe that the brothers were somehow still in the forest, that they existed in some twilight state, neither fully gone nor fully present, and that they were leaving these items as messages, as proof they still existed somewhere. Paranormal investigators became interested in the case. In 1938, a team from the American Society for Psychical Research spent a week in the Deep Hollow, conducting experiments and attempting to document supernatural phenomena. They reported numerous anomalies: compass needles spinning wildly, photographic plates showing strange light patterns, and most disturbingly, several team members reported hearing voices calling their names from deep in the forest. One investigator, a woman named Charlotte Reed, became separated from the group for several hours. When she was finally found, she was incoherent, babbling about seeing the Ellison brothers standing among the trees, watching her, unable or unwilling to speak. Reed never fully recovered. She was institutionalized in 1939 and spent the rest of her life claiming the brothers were trapped between worlds, held by something that fed on their presence. World War II interrupted most civilian investigations, but after the war, interest in the Ellison case resurged. In the 1950s, as American culture became fascinated with unexplained phenomena, the story of the vanished hunters attracted national attention. Magazine articles were written, radio programs discussed the case, and several books attempted to explain what had happened. Theories ranged from the mundane to the fantastic. Some suggested the brothers had staged their disappearance to escape debts or family obligations, though no evidence supported this. Others proposed they'd been murdered by moonshiners protecting illegal stills in the mountains, though no stills were ever found in that area. More exotic theories involved alien abduction, dimensional rifts, or government experiments in mind control. None of these theories adequately explained the evidence, particularly the periodic reappearance of the brothers' belongings in pristine condition decades after they should have deteriorated. In 1967, 60 years after the disappearance, a geologist named Dr. Marcus Flynn was conducting a survey of the Ouachita Mountains for mineral deposits. His work brought him to the Deep Hollow, and out of curiosity, having heard the story of the Ellison brothers, he decided to examine the site where their camp had been. The original camp location was still identifiable, marked by the massive oak tree where the mysterious message had been carved. Flynn examined the tree and made a startling discovery. The carving was still visible, though weathered by 60 years of exposure. But around the original carving, new words had been added, carved in the same style but clearly more recent. The new words read, "Waiting for more." Flynn photographed the tree extensively and reported his finding to local authorities. An investigation determined that the new carving had been made within the previous year, nearly 60 years after the original message. Who had carved it and why remained unknown. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? The discovery of the new carving reignited intense interest in the case. Researchers began investigating more systematically, compiling all known information about the disappearance and its aftermath. A pattern emerged that had been previously overlooked. The items belonging to the Ellison brothers appeared in the forest at regular intervals, roughly every 7 years. 1923, 1928, 1935. The pattern had continued. An item was found in 1942, 1949, 1956, and 1963. Each time, the item was in impossible condition, showing no weathering despite decades of supposed exposure. And each time, the item was found in a different location within the deep hollow, but always within that 2-mile triangle marked by where the rifles had been discovered. Researchers theorized that something was deliberately placing these items, using them to maintain awareness of the case, to ensure the Ellison brothers were not forgotten. But who or what would do this and why? In 1974, a breakthrough occurred that provided some answers while raising even more disturbing questions. A historian named Dr. Evelyn Marsh was researching early settlement patterns in Arkansas and came across records from the 1820s. She found references to the Ouachita region being considered sacred or forbidden by local Native American tribes, specifically the Caddo people who'd inhabited the area before European settlement. The Caddo had stories about certain valleys in the mountains where the boundary between the living world and the spirit world was thin, where people could slip from one to the other without meaning to. The deep hollow was specifically mentioned in several accounts as a place the Caddo avoided, a place where people who entered might not return, or might return changed, no longer fully themselves. Dr. Marsh found a particularly relevant account from an 1828 journal kept by a missionary named Reverend Samuel Briggs. Briggs wrote about a conversation with a Caddo elder who told him that certain families were marked, that they carried a debt from ancestors who'd angered the spirits, and that this debt would be collected across generations, taking family members one by one until the debt was paid. The elder told Briggs that white settlers didn't understand these obligations, that they walked blindly into places they should avoid, and that many would disappear in the years to come. Dr. Marsh investigated whether the Ellison family might have such a debt in their history. She traced the family back through generations, eventually finding records from the 1790s, when the first Ellisons arrived in Arkansas Territory. She discovered something remarkable. The first Ellison in Arkansas, a man named Jedediah, had been a trader who dealt with Native American tribes. In 1796, Jedediah had been accused by a Caddo group of stealing sacred objects from a burial site. The accusation was recorded in territorial records because it had nearly started a war between settlers and the Caddo. Jedediah denied the theft, and the matter was eventually dropped for lack of evidence. But the Caddo had pronounced what they called a bloodline curse, declaring that Jedediah's descendants would be claimed by the spirits he'd offended, taken from the living world as payment for his transgression. Dr. Marsh's research suggested that the disappearances of Ellison family members across generations might be connected to this curse, that the family had been marked for over a century, and that the taking of the 3 brothers in 1907 was simply the curse continuing its work. This theory was controversial. Many researchers rejected it as giving credence to superstition over rational explanation. But Dr. Marsh pointed out that what mattered wasn't whether the curse was objectively real, but whether the Ellison family believed it was real. She argued that if successive generations of Ellisons grew up hearing stories about family members who disappeared, about a debt that must be paid, this belief could have psychological effects that might explain some of the strange behavior reported. Thomas Ellison's premonition the morning of the disappearance. His dream about being followed by something that wasn't quite human could have been his subconscious working through generational trauma and expectation. The family might have been unconsciously reenacting a pattern they'd been taught to expect. This theory had merit, but it didn't explain the physical evidence, the items that appeared decades after they should have, the carved messages, the reports of anomalous phenomena in the deep hollow. Belief could shape behavior, but it couldn't preserve a leather journal in pristine condition for 70 years in a hostile environment. The Ellison case remained unsolved, a complex puzzle with pieces that didn't fit together no matter how they were arranged. In the late 20th century, as the family members who'd known the brothers personally died off, the case became more legend than active investigation. The Deep Hollow became a destination for amateur paranormal investigators, people fascinated by the story who hoped to experience something inexplicable. Some reported strange occurrences, others found nothing. The forest rangers who managed that section of the Ouachita National Forest grew accustomed to recovering lost hikers who'd gone into the Deep Hollow and become disoriented. Most came out safely, but occasionally someone would disappear for days before being found miles away, confused and unable to explain where they'd been. None of these were Ellisons, though. Since 1907, no one with the Ellison surname had disappeared from the mountains. Either the family had learned to avoid the area, or the debt Dr. Marsh had theorized about had been paid in full with the taking of the three brothers. In 2007, exactly 100 years after the brothers vanished, the Montgomery County Historical Society organized a commemorative event. Family descendants, historians, and curious citizens gathered at a park in Mount Ida to discuss the case and honor the memory of Thomas, Robert, and Daniel Ellison. A descendant of Thomas Ellison, a great-grandson named Martin, spoke about growing up with the story of the missing brothers, about how it had shaped his family's identity. He said the hardest part wasn't not knowing what happened, but feeling like the story was unfinished, like the brothers were still waiting for someone to find them. After the formal program, Martin announced that he intended to hike into the Deep Hollow the following morning, to visit the site where his great-grandfather had disappeared, to perhaps find some personal closure. Several people tried to dissuade him, reminding him of the history, warning him about the dangers both natural and otherwise. Martin insisted. He said he'd been planning this for years, waiting for the 100th anniversary, feeling it was important to mark the occasion at the actual location. Martin Ellison entered the Deep Hollow on the morning of December 3, 2007. He went alone, despite offers from others to accompany him. He carried a GPS device, a satellite phone, and camping equipment for 2 nights. He planned to camp at the site where his great-grandfather's camp had been, spend some time in reflection and remembrance, and return on December 5th. He checked in by satellite phone the evening of December 3rd, reporting that he'd reached the site safely, that he'd found the old oak tree with the carved messages, and that he planned to spend the next day exploring the area. That was the last communication received from Martin Ellison. When he failed to call again on December 4th as planned, his family notified authorities. A search was organized. Rangers and volunteers entered the Deep Hollow and found Martin's campsite, abandoned but intact. His tent was set up, his equipment was there, but Martin was gone. His GPS device was found in the tent, showing that he'd hiked to several locations within the 2-mile triangle where his great-grandfather's belongings had been found over the years. But there was no indication of where Martin had gone after returning to camp. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? The search for Martin Ellison lasted for 2 weeks. Hundreds of volunteers combed the area. Helicopters with thermal imaging flew over the forest. Search dogs were brought in. Nothing. Martin had vanished as completely as his great-grandfather and great-uncles had a century before. The coincidence of the dates, exactly 100 years apart, seemed too significant to be accidental. Researchers who'd followed the case for years were both horrified and grimly satisfied. The pattern had repeated. Whatever took the Ellison brothers in 1907 had taken another Ellison in 2007, suggesting that Dr. Marsh's curse theory might have been correct, that the debt continued across generations, or alternatively, that something in that place was still active, still capable of making people disappear without leaving any trace. The Rangers closed the deep hollow to public access following Martin's disappearance. Too many people had gone missing or had strange experiences there over the past century. It was deemed too dangerous. The closure remains in effect today, though it hasn't stopped people from entering illegally, drawn by the story, hopping to solve the mystery or experience the paranormal. The carved message on the old oak tree was examined again after Martin's disappearance. The words "they are ours" and "waiting for more" were still visible, weathered but readable. No new words had been added. Researchers analyzed the carvings extensively, trying to determine who might have made them and when. The consensus was that the original "they are ours" message had indeed been carved in December 1907, around the time the brothers disappeared. The "waiting for more" edition appeared to have been carved sometime in the 1960s, based on tree growth patterns and weathering analysis. Who carved it remained unknown, but the implications were clear. Someone or something had been waiting for more Ellisons, and that wait had been rewarded when Martin walked into the forest 100 years after his ancestors. In the years since Martin's disappearance, his family has maintained hope, as Margaret Ellison had done a century before, that he might somehow return. His wife has kept his belongings. His children have been told to watch for any sign of him. But 15 years have passed with no word, no trace. The pattern suggests that if the past is any guide, Martin's belongings will begin appearing in the forest, perfectly preserved, found at regular intervals by hikers and hunters, each discovery a reminder that the mystery continues, that the deep hollow has not given up its secrets. Some descendants of the original Ellison brothers have had their DNA added to missing persons databases, hoping that if remains are ever found, identification will be possible. Others have researched the family curse theory, trying to understand what their ancestors might have done to deserve this fate, looking for ways to break the pattern before another generation faces the same terror. The question that cannot be answered, the question that transforms this from a tragic story of missing people into something far more unsettling, is this: where did they go? Not just where physically, though that question remains, but where in a more fundamental sense. When the Ellison brothers walked away from their camp in 1907, when Martin Ellison left his tent in 2007, where did they walk to? The evidence suggests they didn't simply die in the forest. Bodies decay, leave traces, return to the earth. But the Ellisons left nothing. They seem to have been removed from reality entirely, taken to a place or state that exists outside normal space and time. The preservation of their belongings, appearing decades after they should have rotted, suggests something is deliberately maintaining a connection between that place and this one, using physical objects as anchors or messages. The carved words "they are ours" imply possession, ownership. Something claimed the Ellisons, declared them its property. But what exercises such ownership? What has the power to make people cease to exist in this world while maintaining enough connection to leave messages and preserved objects behind? These questions lead to uncomfortable territory, to possibilities that challenge rational worldviews. The scientific mind rejects supernatural explanations, insists there must be a rational answer involving human agency, natural phenomena misunderstood, or psychological factors creating false narratives. But a century of investigation has produced no rational answer that fits all the evidence. At some point, the absence of a conventional explanation becomes its own kind of evidence, suggesting that what happened to the Ellisons exists outside the boundaries of conventional possibility. The deep hollow remains closed to public access, a patch of forest in the Ouachita Mountains that the Forest Service prefers people avoid. Rangers who patrol near it report the same feelings that were described over a century ago: unease, the sense of being watched, an urge to leave. Electronic equipment malfunctions more frequently in that area than in surrounding regions. Compass readings are unreliable. Wildlife is scarce, as if animals instinctively avoid the place. These observations have been documented but not explained. Some rangers privately admit they believe the stories, that they think something wrong exists in the deep hollow, something that predates human settlement and will persist long after humans are gone. Other rangers dismiss such talk as superstition and imagination, insisting the area is simply an unremarkable piece of forest that's accumulated an unfortunate history and an undeserved reputation. The Ellison case file remains open with the Montgomery County Sheriff's Department, though it hasn't been actively investigated in years. The file is thick with reports, witness statements, photographs, and theories. Periodically, someone will request access to it, a researcher or writer interested in the story, hoping to find some detail that's been overlooked, some clue that will finally provide an answer. No one has found it yet. The truth, if it can be called truth, seems to be that the Ellison brothers walked into a place where the normal rules stopped applying, where the boundary between what is and what isn't became permeable, and they slipped through into absence. Whether they still exist somewhere in some form is a question that can only be answered with speculation. The fact that their belongings continue to appear suggests something of them persists, whether that's consciousness or merely objects serving as markers of lives that ended but haven't quite finished. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? So we return to the image that opened this investigation. 3 brothers walking into a forest they knew intimately, carrying rifles and provisions, confident in their skills and knowledge, unaware they were about to cross a threshold from which there is no return. The forest accepted them. The forest kept them. And the forest, patient and eternal, waits for the next Ellison to venture too deep, to ignore the warnings, to believe that family history and pattern don't apply to them. The carved message says it plainly, waiting for more. The debt continues, the pattern persists. And somewhere in those mountains, in a hollow where the light falls differently and the silence weighs heavier than it should, the Ellison brothers remain, neither present nor fully absent, caught in whatever space exists between those states, perhaps aware of the years passing in the world they left, perhaps not, perhaps screaming silently for rescue that will never come, or perhaps at peace in a way that we cannot comprehend. The only certainty is that they are not coming home, just as Martin will not come home, just as whoever enters that place next will not come home. The forest knows, and the forest, patient and hungry and eternal, waits.